Good afternoon. This is part two of our conversation about what is culture. When we were last together, we covered a lot of preliminary topics, including what are some of the core elements of culture, what are some things that sociologists study about culture, and how do we discuss the relationship between culture and society. For the remainder of our conversation about what is culture, I will just pick up where we left off by mentioning again those terms that we use to characterize both the parameters and intersections of cultural elements, and these include the terms mainstream culture, subculture, and counterculture. And please note some of the finer distinctions across these terms, especially with regard to the notion of counterculture, where one of the key aspects about that concept has to do with the elements of culture being best described as created in opposition to those of mainstream culture. So, an important question that we consider and explore in various spheres of life is, how does culture affect us? How does it affect us throughout the life course and in different areas of our lives? And in short, we can answer that question in the following way. We can say that in some ways, the way that culture affects us is it gives us something or it takes something from us. Another way of putting that is to say culture reflects what we already are. And this aligns with what has been termed the reflection hypothesis theory. Culture absorbs what is characteristic of a group or a society. And what we see and detect within culture is somewhat of a mere indication of what already exists. On the other hand, we can say that culture actually shapes us in our settings in a variety of ways, evident not just in our values and our norms, but most definitely in those two particular elements of culture. So culture either reflects what we are or it shapes us through the socialization experience or through this process that we call hegemony. So the first of these two possibilities that we'll talk about is reflection theory. Reflection theory is an account of the correlation between social groups and their culture that frames cultural elements as mirroring what is already fairly accurate about a group or a larger society or social entity. This account is occasionally used to guide sociologists who study the role of culture in modern life, often focusing on mass media images um, and its content, or whether these have an effect on those exposed. The reflection theory hypothesis would predict relatively little or no impact or influence of culture on groups and entities, because the assumption is that, for example, mass media projects the values, beliefs, etc., often already in existence in the population. Because the media often aspire to appeal to the most broad-based audience, the aim there is often kind of a middle ground in content and depiction of images and ideas. And so um, there's a significant capital investment often invested in market research that tries to identify cultural elements, what people value, what they think, what they believe, what they do, and why. And that information is then used to create programming that builds upon these insights, rarely aligning perfectly with what is actually the case, but it produces characters that align with some important elements in mainstream culture. This particular way of characterizing the relationship between groups and cultures would thus suggest that culture really doesn't have an effect or shape individuals in society. A concrete example of that would be to say that viewing certain types of media content, whether the example would be um, uh, movies or programming that has certain types of violent themes, we should not expect it to affect people's rates of similar types of behavior to change in response to viewing. This and other characterizations of the relationship between culture and groups certainly comes with its gaps in terms of what it can address. For example, it's not really well suited to explaining why some cultural components change their connotation and significance over time. And also, another critique is that um, its hypotheses exclusively frame the relationship between culture and groups as unidirectional. And there's no space for acknowledging that individuals have some sense of agency in terms of shaping elements of culture. The other way in which we could characterize the relationship between culture and groups is to take note of something that we call hegemony. Hegemony refers to soft, kind of influential power through that shapes people and groups through the context of elements of culture. It refers to entities that have prominence or leadership over the collective, and they influence all aspects of life on a day-to-day basis, often relatively invisible to us unless we are particular tuned into it. A good example of this would be what we often find ourselves doing on February 14th, Valentine's Day. If you're in a relationship, an intimate relationship with a significant other, some would say that you're feeling the influence of culture. If you feel a strong need to have to go out and purchase something special for your partner, whether it's flowers or a special dinner, or sometimes do something to recognize the importance of that relationship to you. And so many would say that this is one way in which culture shapes us, because we have ideas about what is ideal or best suited in given situations that doesn't originate from ourselves. The idea to do so is not our own, but it's been imparted upon us from an outside and different source. And in this way, it influences our values, beliefs, and or behaviors. Next, we'll turn our attention to another important area of culture, and that is language and other aspects of symbolic culture. To begin with, note that the book says of language systems that they are the foundation of every culture. And that's a very big claim. The foundation of every culture. And our language systems, defined as such, can be considered a cultural universal. And they reflect aspects of social life, meaning, and more embedded within their structure and content. Our language systems operate as a cultural tool. They provide us with an essential way of communicating. They facilitate our ability to engage in certain types of behaviors. Language systems shape how we think and what we think. And obviously, they allow us to transmit and receive important shared meanings. There are two early 20th century linguistic anthropologists that are well known for many reasons. Among them is their crafting of a hypothesis that at first glance is very simple, but it's a profound insight that they discerned in studying things that have to do with language systems. And the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis goes like this: the structure and content of a language influences and at times may determine a speaker's worldview. And included in that notion of a worldview is our ability to perceive things, the ways it affects how we categorize our experiences and name them. And at times they would say it affects our sensory experiences. And yes, they're merely talking about the structure and content of our language systems. Here's an example of what they would mean by that phenomenon. You've heard the term a sommelier. This is often a person who serves in a professional capacity, either at a wine bar or a fine dining restaurant. And this person is defined as a wine steward who is credentialed and knowledgeable when it comes to wine theory and service and pairings and so forth. But because of their training, because of their skill set, and the nomenclature associated with their training, they actually are well poised to be able to taste and smell characteristics associated with this particular beverage better than most people simply because they have the vocabulary and the repertoire of sensory skills to do so. So they have the terminology to describe some very nuanced features of wines that most people are simply incapable of doing because it's not simply put built into their vocabulary. And that's an example of what Sapir and Whorf meant as they were talking about the influence of the structure and content of language systems on our thought processes. Another important aspect of language in our symbolic culture would be these things we call cultural narratives. What are cultural narratives? These are co created stories, often with fascinating manifest and latent functions. You remember what those two terms are, I hope. The term manifest function refers to the relatively known or expected outcomes associated with behaviors, events, or actions. And latent functions, that term refers to the relatively unexpected, somewhat unknown, or invisible outcomes associated with the same types of behaviors. That definition is not to suggest that latent functions are rare or uncommon, but as the definition suggests, just not as readily anticipated. Cultural narratives often serve a purpose in social and cultural settings, one of which is the following. It's believed that they help communities reinforce their norms, preserve their beliefs, and at times strengthen their sense of identity, their sense of oneness through sharing knowledge and experiences. And here are three examples or categories of this cultural element that we would call cultural narratives. The first one includes fables, stories, fictitious stories that we tell young people these stories contain information about community values, maybe the value of determination or patience, or what are believed to be some vices. An example of a fable would be the story of the tortoise and the hare. And if you've heard that fable from a larger work called Aesop's Fable, that story is about a race that convenes between two animals. And at first glance, it should be obvious who the winner is going to be, and that would be the hare. However, that's not the case. The tortoise is the one who wins because the tortoise is the one of the two participants in the race that is consistent, that keeps moving, staying the course, while the hare makes a few detours, takes a nap along the way, dilly-dallies, and the underlying message has to do with perseverance. So fables are examples of cultural narratives, stories that help communicate things that are important to a community. Artifacts are another example, or can be another example, of cultural narratives. Sometimes we can identify things that are important to people groups that allow those groups to share, to pass on to others important aspects of family history or family identities. In our own family, we have just a small number of artifacts that would fit this description. There's a dining room table that we have that was For years, the primary table that sat in my grandmother's kitchen. Around this table, everyone would gather for their daily meals, and that included two adults and seven children. And it was not a very big table, but this was a multi purpose table. It was the table that they used for doing the work of preparing and canning some vegetables from the garden. It was the table that was used where they would um, drop and dress a hog in preparation for curing it for family use. And so stories along those lines would often emerge when we have gathered over the years around that table for meals. The way I've described it, it probably sounds like it's a horrible looking table, but it's been refinished. It's not yucky looking, um, but at first glance, it's just a regular looking table. But it's one that facilitates some shared discussions in our families. Special event stories are examples of cultural narratives that people are often more familiar with. Examples of these include the story we tell, or the story that some people tell to young children about Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. Think about some of the cultural stories we tell about Santa Claus. Here's this person we're supposed to go visit leading up to Christmas Day, tell them what we want, what we hope for, what we'd like to see under a Christmas tree, their ideas about what this person is supposed to look like, how they're supposed to be dressed. And then there's some associated expectations in terms of what they will do or leave behind on Christmas Day. Sometimes the story has to do with leaving gifts out for Santa Claus the night before. And of course, there's the special event story about the Tooth Fairy. And I have a couple of notes about the Tooth Fairy on the next page. The Tooth Fairy, well, the trivia that goes along with that is that this is someone or something that's supposed to visit children in the night when they're sleeping. They're not supposed, their presence should not be detected. And it's apparently the job of the Tooth Fairy to leave behind a present for a child who's just lost a tooth. Often it's money, sometimes it's a small gift. I always like to hear from students if their household engaged in sharing this story, how much they were left by the Tooth Fairy if they placed a tooth under the pillow. One poll reported that the average amount left for children per tooth was just under $4, which sounded like a lot to me, but maybe that's the going rate. One of the things that we ask about these types of cultural narratives is really not so much the details that are associated with the stories, but what is their manifest and latent function? What is their purpose? And as we think about, say, the example of the Tooth Fairy, some have offered that this type of story is often helpful to take the edge off the at times unpleasant experience that children have as it concerns having to have a tooth pulled, maybe having to swab it to slow some minor bleeding associated with it, just kind of adding a ring of cheerfulness or happiness around a short experience that may not be so much fun for children. And so we think about them in a variety of ways, one of which is what is their purpose in the context of social life? Rituals will be our last cultural element that I'll say a couple things about, and then I'll close with a few comments reviewing the results from your observational study of faculty doors, and I'll mention a couple of things about your next discussion post that requires you to listen to the podcast called The Culture Inside and answer a couple of questions about your understanding of insights from that program. So rituals. Rituals are different from habits. Rituals are a set of actions that are performed with some regularity, not just for the purpose of doing them and accomplishing an immediate outcome, but they're believed to have symbolic value, and they often offer or help sustain group identity. They're not always associated with religious settings, but we can certainly identify a range of rituals that are associated with our religious traditions. I mentioned that we think of rituals as being very distinct from habits, which are best viewed as individual behaviors that tend to have expected results in terms of some sort of reward. When I think of habits, I think of examples of people I've known who always wore a red shirt on their test days because they believed that it would bring them uh, a higher test grade or better performance. Or they would eat at a very specific time in the late afternoon to enhance um, something that they thought would be positive for them the next day. I've heard of people describing their habits of making their bed in the morning because they simply believe that they would carry with them through the rest of the day a feeling of a sense of accomplishment, in the least, knowing that they could return at the end of the day to a bed that was nicely made if they didn't get much done otherwise. There are different, sociologists have different views about rituals, how they operate, what is their purpose, and what are their implications. Beginning with one of our earlier scholars, Emil Durkheim. He was very interested in this cultural element and believed that this particular aspect of culture was very important for purposes of establishing a sense of what he called collective effervescence in the context of their practice. So when people and groups would be engaged in ritual practices, it said just being part of that had the outcome of creating not just a shared memory, an account of something that happened, but a strong set of feelings that further grounded the importance, the symbolic importance of that particular activity, that they give validity to or affirm particular beliefs, just going through the processes of enacting the activities involved with a set of rituals. They're viewed as very important in that particular context. A more contemporary sociologist named Van Gennep focused on rituals not so much in that way, but viewed them as, he called them markers of passage associated with important life transitions. That rituals were very important to people to experience because they were grounding. They were perhaps we could call them perceived as launching pads for transitions into a next phase of life. Examples of this would be marriage rituals, graduation rituals, and ceremonies, things we do to acknowledge the birth of a new child and a family. There's some what we call coming of age rituals, uh, getting your driver's license, things that we may do when we turn 21. Some people participate in what we call debutante balls. Viewing rituals in this way, I think, is very interesting, especially in light of what we heard about young people's experiences coming out of, say, high school during the COVID lockdown. That first spring of 2020, when just about everything was shut down, those high school graduation rituals simply didn't happen. Um, Thousands and thousands of high school seniors were not allowed to take part in those activities that mark their passage from that phase of their educational experience into the next phase, which may or may not have been college, but it was certainly expressed as a significant loss. And so viewing rituals in that way very much resonates with people who have that particular experience. So I'm going to return on Tuesday with some questions for you about your experience in gathering data from faculty doors. I can't remember exactly how many questions I asked you to consider as you examine one or more faculty doors, But I wanted you to do that for a couple of reasons. One was just to have an easy, simple experience gathering observational data, data that was hopefully easily accessible to you, um, for you to go through that experience, have a sense of what it feels like to be a short term researcher, but also to be able to have the opportunity to look at the full data set and to see what, if anything, we can learn about um, the culture of Berry faculty. Altogether, when we look at the summary data on 24 observations, do the data suggest anything about the culture of faculty at Berry? Is it our sense that Berry faculty support or violate some of the office door rules? You may not know it, but we actually do have some requirements in terms of what we are supposed to post on our doors. I'm not aware of any norms that are stated in the negative, things that we're not allowed to post on doors, but we are given some requirements for information that should be readily available on our office doors. And then it would give us an opportunity to get a sense of whether or not we could say, is there a subculture of faculty? And we would make that assessment based on the type of information that is posted on their office door. So what you see on this slide is a small sample of some of the pie charts that were created um, uh, from that data collection effort. You can see that a little over 62% of the 24 doors that were examined, it looks like the faculty member posted um, the full amount of information about themselves, not just their name, but their title and their rank. It looks like most of the cases came from the Evans School. It looks like the majority of faculty doors did not include any messages that were political, social, or justice issue based. It looks like most people, about 70%, didn't provide a place to write or leave messages. Maybe that's because we don't need to do that. We can rely on emails. It looks like a little over half posted their office and class schedule. Yay, because that's actually a requirement. I was very surprised to see that around 46% of the faculty did not present both pieces of information. And I was also surprised to see that about half posted a cartoon on their door. So very interesting. We'll come back to this on Tuesday. The last thing I want to mention, I'm skipping by this thing called story circles. That was going to be a small group activity, but that would not work out as well in a Zoom class. I just want to remind you that your response to the second discussion post is due, I believe, on the 6th. And it requires that you listen to a podcast about 50 minutes in length. It's called The Culture Inside. And as before, it is a two-part prompt. Initially, part one, you're to answer a couple short questions about your understanding of what's going on in the podcast. What elements of culture were two men, Frankie and Ray, concerned about, not wanting to have, quote, inside them? It asks you to describe what you found most interesting or surprising about their stories, and what did you learn about how culture shapes us? And then, as before, wait until a couple of people have listed their part one, and then share your response to their post as part of your required assignment. So that's a wrap for today. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next week, Tuesday morning. Thank you. Bye.